Tarkovsky, the great opponent of Andrei Tarkovsky, of Eisenstein, as you probably know, he was opposed to this. His idea was no violent cutting interventions. True cinematic art must be more intensive, like with long shots and so on. You allow the event or the presence to come into its own passively. But I claim it's merely a different form of torturing. If Eisenstein can be called the poet of this more active, sadistic torturing, you combine, Tarkovsky practices a cinematic equivalent of what I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in English you call that medieval torture instrument a rack, where they stretch the leg. That's what Tarkovsky is doing, and it has wonderful effects. Tarkovsky was very said, if you just shot a normal event, like in his maybe masterpiece Mirror, a girl in panic running to the newspaper printing house because in Soviet Union she maybe overlooked a mistake, misspelling Stalin's name in an obscene way. This would cost her life. If you shoot this normally, it's nothing, just a girl running there. But what Tarkovsky does in his Mirror is he protracts this scene into quarter of an hour endless running, puts it on a rack, and you have the so-called aesthetic effect. So I can well imagine Eisenstein and Tarkovsky, if they were to meet, debate as two torturers. Let's say a Latino-American colonist torturer and a KGB torturer. One says, no, it's better to cut prisoners. The other says, cut and squeeze the testicles. The other says, no, just stretch them. And so on. But you see my point. My point is that I like this line of thought, which also goes against the so-called postmodern historicism, which is the linguistic historicism. There is an irreducible plurality of beings. All we can do is tell stories about it from our irreducible, specific, historically specific horizons of meaning. And again, as so-called postmodernists like to emphasize, there is no a priori universal medium of communication. All we can do, the only appropriate universal ethics is to allow the space for this very plurality. As Richard Rorty liked to emphasize, everyone should be allowed to tell freely his or her story, the story of his or her happening. What I think is that, on the contrary, one in a very traditional way even, I like to follow Hegel here, who claim that when we think in language. Of course, there is no thinking outside language. We think in language, but against language. This is the, if you want, torturing aspect. Thinking is not natural to our, everyday thinking, which is passively embedded in language. Thinking is literally counter-natural. And as such, we can, with great effort, torturing effort, we can force language to formulate, we can make it receptible to some translinguistic truth through this procedure of torturing. So let me again refer to Benjamin. You probably know all Benjamin's classical opposition between mythic violence and divine violence. Mythic violence as the Staatsbildende, as the state-forming violence, the obscene, dark background of state power, what your noble Vice President Dick Cheney likes to call the dark side that we should not talk too much about. And on the opposite, the redemptive, emancipatory violence, the so-called divine violence. And I think this covers the two violences that I mentioned till now. The violence about which Heidegger talks, this violence inherent to the very imposition, to put it simply, of a symbolic universe, or to put it in Heidegger's terms, a certain disclosure of the meaning of being. This would have been mythic violence of language. And Heidegger himself talked about mythos. Mythos as a certain articulation of the meaning of being. to put it in very simplistic terms, which I know violate Heidegger's strict terminology, the way reality appears to us as meaningful, how we experience it. This is the mythic violence of language. But what we don't find in Heidegger, and I think we should supplement here Heidegger, would have been the divine violence of language, which is precisely this torturing of language, not Staatsbilden, that is to say, not Sprachbilden, but Sprachzerstörend, destroying of language. In the same way that Heidegger talks about, that Benjamin talks about divine violence as Staatszerstörung, as destroying the state. So I think this is why, if you read my book on violence, even if you looked at it, I hope you got the point, which is that it's a defense of violence. We need violence. Emancipatory violence, the act of liberation is always a violent act. What do I mean by this? I recently saw, after 20 years, Bernardo Bertolucci's, okay, it's a little bit naive, old Stalinist epic, Novecento, the 20th century. And I was nicely surprised by a beautiful thing about half an hour into the film, where the workers in that large estate in northern Italy protest to their master, who because of economic crisis wants to lower radically their wages, and he tries to explain to them, it's market, it's this, it's that. They said, but we are starving, we cannot. And then he explodes and says, but do you have ears? Don't you understand? Are you so stupid? You cannot even hear what I'm telling you, economic necessity, and so on and so on. And then it's quite a nice, shocking scene. One of the workers takes out a knife, this kind of a crooked knife for special uses, and cuts off his ear and gives it to him, like, here you have our ear if you want, and so on. There is always something like this in redemption, in gaining freedom. Freedom hurts. So now let me go on a little bit. How do these two modes of violence function in art? Let me begin with a poem. Now, okay, this was the difficult part. Now we move to more obscene matters. Let me go with a short poem. Listen carefully. Convert to my new faith, O crowd. I offer you what no one has had before. I offer you inclemency and wine. The one who won't have bread will be fed by the light of my sun. People, nothing is forbidden in my faith. There is loving and drinking, and looking at the sun for as long as you want. And this Godhead forbids you nothing. Oh, obey my call, brothers, people, crowd, and so on. And I think it's a great poem, but it's a correct poem. Its author is, of course, I heard to got the joke, Radovan Karadzic, the Serb-born criminal who is now in jail. And I think he got it correctly. I mean, what he describes is a carnival. It's an obscene divinity which calls you through him, who is the spokesperson of this divinity, to an eternal orgy of transgression. You know, you will be fed by the life of my son, wine, loving, drinking. Nothing is forbidden in my faith. This Godhead forbids you nothing, and so on and so on. What I'm trying to say here, two things. First, that this provides an important key to the functioning of so-called ethnic, religious, however we call it, fundamentalism. It's not, as some stupid sociologists try to convince us, that today's fundamentalism is a so-called escape from freedom. Like, you know, that's how the story goes. We live in postmodern times, which are no longer in advance, permissive times, no longer overdetermined structure by a firm set of values. We are free with an overload of freedom. We have to choose everything from up to our sex orientation, religion, ethnic belonging, and so on. And the idea is that this radical uncertainty, this lack of the daily coordinates, firm, ethical, and so on coordinates, causes anxiety. So people who cannot endure it escape backwards into a real or invented tradition, which provides a kind of a sense of certainty. I claim this is at best one side of it. What is much more important is exactly the opposite side. I learned it with a rather nasty personal experience when over 10 years ago, in early 90s, I visited Belgrade, and in a cafe there, a total mistake, lunch, met some people who probably were so-called ethnic slaughterers, whatever we call them. And I got a lesson of a lifetime from them. What they basically told me is, what fear of freedom? For them, they told me, it's modern liberal society which is oppressive and over-regulated. As they told me, what kind of liberal freedom is this? I cannot rape a woman I like, I cannot beat my wife, I cannot smoke, I cannot kill the person I hate, and so on and so on. For the way they experienced ethnic fundamentalism was that it's a movement to apparently you go back, but in this way you are free. You proclaim yourself, I don't know, servant of your nation, and off we go. We can go to Bosnia, we kill, we rape, we are free. For them it was new freedom. And it's not only they who said this. Already Adorno, I advise you to read Adorno's, of the Frankfurt School, text from late 30s already, very interesting one, on the, I think that's the title of the text, the psychological structure of fascist propaganda, where he in a wonderfully perceptive way, and directed probably against the simplifications of Wilhelm Reich and other sexual revolutionaries. Adorno emphasized how Hitler is not a figure of paternal authority. Hitler is a kind of a fake permissive figure, that we shouldn't be seduced by Hitler's explicit language, which says something like, enough of Weimar Germany, decadence, immorality, corruption, time of discipline, our country first, our country needs us, sacrifice for your country. That's only the superficial message. If you know to read between the lines, the true message is, pay lip service to this, obey me, and we can have some fun. Like, kill the Jews, we can have our own carnivals, and so on. It's the same, I claim, with whatever, for example, with Ku Klux Klan here, and so on. This is how it functions, you know. Pay lip service to Western civilization, Christian values, and if you live in the small town in the south of the United States in the 2030s, and every weekend we can have a little bit of fun. Rape some black girls, lynch some black. But this is absolutely crucial. This moment of false carnivalesque opening, of false liberation, which is absolutely crucial for every so-called totalitarianism up to Stalinism. You will say, ask me, where is this in Stalinism? My God, you know who is the greatest theoretician of carnival? Very popular even today, Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian fellow traveler of formalism. A friend of mine who now teaches, I think, in New York, the Russian immigrant who otherwise worked in Germany, Boris Groys, told me that now recently they discovered some private papers, notes of Bakhtin from, I think, the city of Kazan, where he survived the Stalinism, exiled there to work in the library. And they demonstrate clearly that Bakhtin's big work on Carnival, the title is Borges for François Rabelais, the work of the creativity of François Rabelais, was really a coded attempt to understand Stalinism. For Bakhtin, he knew it very well. Carnival was not, you know, this what leftists, fake leftists, I claim, like, oh, the rules are suspended, at least momentarily, the king is beggar, the beggar is the king, we have liberation. No, for him, Stalin is purges, and some trials were a big carnival. It's exactly like the king is a beggar. Today you are, yesterday you were a member of the Politburo, today you are an English spy or traitor or whatever, no? I mean, it was effectively carnival at the high point of Stalinism. From 34 to 37. Just look at the data. In 2 years and a half, 75% of the Central Committee were shot. 80% of the army headquarters were shot, and so on and so on. So you cannot even say, as they usually say, this, I think, totally false thesis of Stalinism as a new class society. No, it wasn't that. the new nomenclatura oppress ordinary people.